Hi everyone, I'm Liz, and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. In today's video, we're going to take all of our finished scrappy trip around the world quilt blocks and turn them into a finished quilt. In this video, I am going to lay out all of my quilt blocks and assemble the top. I'm going to long arm quilt it myself and trim it up and then attach the binding. And then we're going to have a finished scrappy trip around the world quilt. So let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay out all of the quilt blocks on my living room floor, making sure that everything is oriented the correct direction. So if you remember from the previous video, you made 20 blocks total, and we made 10 blocks in 2 different orientations, so that when you lay everything out, it kind of makes these diagonal lines in a certain pattern. So refer back to that link or the previous video for the orientation of the blocks. I am laying my blocks out on my living room floor because I do not have room for a design wall, and this quilt is a little bit too big to fit on my king-size bed, so I just use what I have and use my living room floor. Once I have all the blocks laid out, I pick them up row by row and take them to my sewing machine. Okay, so I've got my first stack of blocks, and I'm going to sew my first row together. So let's start with the first 2 blocks. I like to sew my quilts together row by row. So I'm going to sew all the 4 blocks of the first row, then the second, third, etc. And then I'll end up sewing all the rows together at the end. There's some really cool methods for chain piecing kind of everything at once, but I don't have enough space to have a design wall or to be able to keep the blocks laid out as I work. So I tend to just stack them up, take them to my sewing machine, and I just sew row by row. But yeah, obviously piece this together however is easiest for you. So I'm just going to take my first 2 blocks and I'm going to pin in the center. I'm pinning the same way I pinned to put my blocks together the first time, or to put all the blocks together. So I'm pinning in the center, and then I'm pinning at the first intersection, and over here at the last. I'm not a person who like always pins everything, but I do find it really helpful when you're trying to match up seams. But just for myself, it feels like kind of overkill to pin at every single seam. So I just pin at the center and at the ends for anything that's kind of, you know, this size or smaller. And so as I sew, I am just adjusting my blocks and making sure my seams are lining up and that on the back side the seams are staying pushed open, because I pressed all of my seams open for this. And down here at the bottom, I'm just using the 2 perpendicular seams to kind of help me make sure this corner is staying nice and square. Okay, let's add block number 3. Okay, last block for this row. Okay, so we have our first row of 4 blocks sewn together. So I'm just going to repeat this process 4 more times, and then I'll come back and sew the rows together. Okay, Okay, I have the first 2 rows of my quilt right here. First row, second row, and I need to pin these together so that I can sew them together. And so row 1 goes on top of row 2, and I'm actually gonna flip this whole pile over so that the side I'm working on is closest to me. This is the edge I'm gonna be pinning. And I'm just going to roughly align these. And I'm gonna start by pinning all of the intersections of where my blocks meet. So here's one. Oh, and that's that. So that's the middle. So with something like this, where you have so many little seams you're trying to match, I think the first step for me is just accepting that it's not going to be perfect and that every seam is not going to perfectly match up. But I have some tips and tricks, I think, for like kind of how I approach it to get the best possible outcome, even if, you know, it's a difficult task to line everything up. So as I showed you, I'm going to pin between every block intersection, and then I'm going to come back and start over here, and I'm going to pin in the center of each block. So I'm going to line up the center points. And then on this one, I just need to pin in the center because my edges are already pinned. And same with here, I'm just going to pin in the center. So I've got my pins in. Let's take this to the sewing machine and I'll show you how I sew it together. Okay, so for these big long rows, as I mentioned, we have a lot of seams to align, but I'm not going to stress about it too bad. I have the kind of major intersections and halfway points pinned. So all I'm going to do is make sure that those pieces stay in place, and then anything I need to ease, you know, I kind of ease in these areas, but I have some like spots pinned where I know they're going to match up. So I'm just going to try and do my best and, you know, kind of bunch or pull to line things up as I go. So I'll probably sew the seam a little bit slowly, but that's going to be my method for getting everything to line up. This side is also easier a little bit to sew because it's our straight cut edges, whereas before we were sewing together from the pinked edges, which is fine as long as, you know, you kind of know what you're using as a guideline, but it's always easier, I think, to sew with the straight edge side. So okay, so we have the first 2 rows sewn together, and let's check our work. Yeah, everything seems pretty nicely lined up. Like right here, I feel like looks really good. I do see over here I'm slightly off on the 2 pinks, but again, I'm not going to stress about it because honestly, mostly everything is lining up really nicely. So yeah, okay, so now to add the rest of the rows to this and press it, and then it's ready for quilting. So let me get the quilt top done. Okay, so this is my backing fabric for the quilt, and I think I bought 5 yards, but let me just double check and see what I have here. Yeah, so I have 5 yards, and so since my quilt is 64 by 80, or really mine's about 68 by 80, I am just going to, let's see, 2.5 yards of fabric is 90 inches, so that will need to go across the width. So the panels are going to get sewn together long ways, I guess you would say, with the seam running across the middle horizontally of the quilt. So let me cut this apart And I am just going to cut on the fold here because it's folded nicely in half. And this does not have to be precise. So let's see. I have 2 pieces of fabric that are 42-ish inches across. And so what I'm gonna end up doing, actually let me cut the selvages off before, yeah, okay. Let me cut the selvages and then I'll come back and explain. Okay, so I have the selvages off of both pieces. And so basically what I'm gonna end up doing is just opening these up. And so I'll just kind of look at my pattern and decide, because I mean, I know this is technically the right way up, but I need the fabric to run this direction so it will fit the whole back of my quilt. So I think I'll just run it like this. And so I'll sew the 2 pieces together. Actually, it's probably easier if I just put a graphic up on the screen. But this is kind of the easiest way to assemble a quilt back using yardage, is just to, you know, if your quilt is less than 80 or maybe less than 78 inches in one direction, you can easily use 2.5 yards to put your quilt back together. So that's what I'm doing here. So let me take this to the sewing machine and get a seam in it, and 1 seam, and then I'm ready to quilt. Okay, so update from the sewing machine. I'm sitting at the sewing machine sewing the quilt back together, and I realized I was just doing my math wrong while I was cutting it out. I can run this fabric vertically, like the way it's meant to be run. I was kind of pointing out that the way it was printed, it's meant to run long ways, and I thought I didn't have enough fabric to run it the correct way. I do. My quilt is 80 inches long and 2.5 yards is 90 inches long. And so that's gives me 10 extra inches, like 5 on each side of the overhang. And that is plenty. So, yeah, if you're wondering later, or you're wondering why the graphic maybe didn't match what I said, I'll put that graphic back up here again. This is actually how I assembled my quilt backing. And if you have the same size quilt and you buy 2.5 yards for backing, 5 yards of backing that you split into 2.5 yard pieces, you'll be able to make your backing the same way I made mine. I hope I'm not making that more unclear than it already was. Okay, let me get this back sewn. Okay, so here is the quilt back. And as I just mentioned, I was able to run the panels side by side. So I've measured it, so I know it's gonna fit, but one thing I like to do if I know, or if I think my backing is a little close in size, is to lay it out like this and then lay the quilt top right on top of it to test it. Okay, so as you can see, the 5 yards of backing that I recommended for this quilt is more than enough. Hi, Diego. So we've got plenty of margin top and bottom and side to side. So yeah, this one is now ready to take to the quilters. Okay, so the last step for this quilt is getting its binding put on. So I like to use 2.5-inch strips for my binding, folded in half. So I have prepped my binding, and I did do a bias joining on the binding. If you're interested in a video on that, I filmed one the last time I did a quilt walkthrough, so I'll link that below. So there's a couple of different ways to machine bind, and I showed you a different style in the last binding video I did. And so this time what I'm going to do is kind of the quickest and easiest machine binding method, which is kind of my favorite one and the one I use most often. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my binding onto the back of the quilt first, and then fold it over and top stitch down onto the front of the quilt. So yeah, let me get that started. So where I've positioned my camera, like my tripod, is probably not the best. I have a feeling I'm going to be jostling it quite a bit as I sew this binding, so I'll keep an eye on that, and hopefully it's not too annoying. I've got to figure out a better way to film sometimes on my sewing machine. Okay, and so I just like to start in the middle of the bottom or one of the sides of the quilt, and I leave myself about, I don't know, 5 to 6 inches of a tail. And so then I use kind of almost a 3/8 of an inch, like a little bit more than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to sew the binding down onto the back of the quilt. So then when I get down into the corner, I do my usual corners where I stop a 1/4 inch away from this bottom edge. And then I turn the quilt at a 45 and come off that corner. Then for the corner, just fold your binding straight up, creating a 45-degree angle in the corner, and then fold it back straight down, lining up that top fold with the top edge of your quilt, and then resume your sewing. So stopping my binding when I get within about 6 or so inches from where I started. And so now I need to join my binding. I am going to join with just a straight seam rather than creating a bias, because this is the same fabric and it's a busy print. So once I join it here, you're not going to notice. So I don't think I need to go to the trouble of joining on the bias. So I am just going to join with a straight seam. So I just create a really good crease, because I fold these pieces into where they meet and create a really good crease so I can use that to guide my sewing. But first I'll trim this down to about a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and so then I just kind of open up the seam allowance and use my fingers to press the seam allowance open. And then fold in half and lay down and make sure it is the right length. And it is. So now let's sew that in place. Okay, so we have our binding sewn onto the back of the quilt, and so the next step is going to be to, oh, well, let me trim that thread. Okay, so the next step is going to be to fold the binding around to the front and top stitch to finish. Some people at this point like to take their binding or their quilt over to the ironing board and press their binding open, like flat from the back. I find with 2.5-inch binding, I don't really need to do that because I have plenty of fabric to wrap around and position it where I need it. But that is a common step at this point, but I just skip it and go straight to folding it around to the front and top stitching. Okay, and so now the next step is just going to be to top stitch from the top of the quilt, and you're going to want to catch the edge of your binding right kind of past the seam where you sewed it onto the back. And so you'll see a line of top stitching on the edge of the binding, and then you should see a line of stitching right next to the binding on the back of the quilt. And so I am using the cream RFL thread I used for piecing just because I feel like it'll blend nicely on this binding print. And normally my backings are lighter, so the cream works really well. If I had a dark green thread, I would probably switch that out for the bobbin just so it disappeared a little bit more, but I don't have a dark green or anything that I think would look really good here, so I think the cream will, while it might stand out a little bit, I think the cream will actually match the best of the threads I have, so I'm using cream in the top and in the bobbin. So when I'm folding, I'm just making sure that the fold is crossing over where I sewed it onto the back. So I make sure all of the raw edges and stitching are enclosed in the binding. And I'm keeping my line of stitching about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch inside the edge of my binding. And then you can see here, there'll be a little line of stitching where you're sewing your binding onto the front. But yeah, I'll show you what it looks like at the end. Let me get the rest of the binding on. Okay, so then here is what your corner will look like after you turn your corner. And so again, you can see the little straight line of stitching on the back, but I think it's totally fine for the time savings of putting on your binding this way, especially because this is not a gift where I kind of want things to be more perfect. This is a quilt for me to enjoy on the couch during the Christmas season while watching cheesy Christmas movies on Netflix. So yeah, let me get the rest of the binding put on and I'll show you the finished quilt. Okay, so that's it. You've made your quilt now. Now you get to enjoy it. I am so happy with how this finished quilt turned out. It's my new favorite, definitely my favorite Christmas quilt I've ever made, and really simple to do. Loved having the 2 jelly rolls, which meant I didn't have to cut any of my fabric out. Even with my kind of measurement mishap, I feel like I was able to work around it and build my blocks in a way so that everything lined up. And in the end, I think everything lined up really nicely, and I'm just super happy with how this quilt turned out. So thank you guys so much for watching and joining in. If you make any of these quilts and post them on Instagram, please tag me or email me a picture. I would love to see the quilts you guys make using this tutorial. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.